Its power would rival governments, its reach would span continents, and its architects would become legends of both wealth and terror. But before there was Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, the man called El Viceroy, there was his brother, Amado, El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies. The story begins in Navolato, Sinaloa, in the 1960s. Amid fields of sugarcane and maize, one family name began to carve its place in the underworld: Carrillo Fuentes. Vicente was born into a family that understood the rules of survival. In Sinaloa, loyalty was currency, and ambition was a dangerous game. His older brother, Amado, was already chasing a bigger dream, not the dusty roads of their hometown, but the skies above it. By the early 1980s, Amado had joined the Guadalajara cartel, working under the shadow of Felix Gallardo and the rising Mexican Drug Federation. Vicente watched from a distance. He was quiet, analytical, and calculating. Those who knew him said he wasn't the loud one. He wasn't the shooter or the showman. He was the planner, the kind of man who could turn chaos into order and profit. When the Guadalajara cartel fractured in the late 1980s, Mexico's drug map exploded. Each lieutenant took a corner: Tijuana, Sinaloa, and Juárez. Amado Carrillo Fuentes seized Ciudad Juárez, a border city pulsing with opportunity and danger. Juárez was the crown jewel of drug smuggling, just a stone's throw from El Paso, Texas, and the vast American market. Whoever controlled Juárez controlled billions. Vicente soon joined his brother. Together, they modernized trafficking, using technology, aviation, and bribery with the precision of corporate executives. Amado built the empire in the skies. Vicente managed the network on the ground. One flew the planes, the other built the infrastructure. Together, they made history. By the mid-1990s, Amado's legend was beyond comprehension. He had a fleet of Boeing 727s, ferrying cocaine from Colombia to Mexico, sometimes refueling mid-air, all destined for the U.S. border. Money poured in faster than it could be counted. The Carrillo Fuentes brothers had turned trafficking into an industry. Juárez was their corporate headquarters, their fortress, their kingdom. But every empire that soars must eventually descend. On July 4, 1997, in Mexico City, Amado Carrillo Fuentes lay on an operating table. He was attempting to alter his face, to disappear. The Lord of the Skies wanted to become a ghost. But instead of rebirth, came death. Complications during surgery. In one night, the Juárez cartel lost its king, and the world turned its eyes to the brother left behind. Where others saw crisis, Vicente saw opportunity. Within weeks of Amado's death, he moved to consolidate control. He summoned lieutenants, silenced dissent, and promised stability. He didn't have his brother's charisma, but he had his discipline. The cartel called him El Viceroy, the viceroy who ruled in the name of a fallen king. Under Vicente's command, the Juárez cartel reorganized like a military machine. Routes were redrawn, operations streamlined, and enemies quietly removed. He had learned one crucial lesson from his brother's empire. Visibility is death. Vicente ruled from the shadows. Few photographs of him existed. Fewer still had ever heard his voice. Between 1997 and the early 2000s, the Juárez cartel was a juggernaut. Billions flowed north. Weapons and bribes flowed south. To the public, Juárez was a city of factories and workers. To the underworld, it was the beating heart of global narco trafficking. But power breeds enemies, and in the shadows, another force was rising, led by a man who refused to play by the old rules: Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. El Chapo, once a loose ally, had ambitions of his own. He wanted Juárez. He wanted the routes. And he was willing to drown the desert in blood to get them. Vicente knew a storm was coming. He fortified his operations, armed his men, and trusted only his family. But in this world, family is both a shield and a weakness. As the conflict brewed, the city of Juárez began to change. Murders climbed into the thousands. Bodies appeared on roadsides, bridges, and empty lots. Ordinary citizens lived under the constant sound of gunfire and the heavy silence of fear. One journalist at the time said, "You'd hear the shots at night. You'd see the cars burn by morning. No one knew who was fighting who anymore, only that Juárez belonged to death." The fragile alliance between the cartels disintegrated under greed and revenge. The Juárez Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel declared open war. For Vicente, this was no longer business, it was survival. And survival demanded cruelty. What began as a trade war became a slaughterhouse. By 2008, Juárez was the deadliest city on earth. As police and military raids intensified, Vicente's empire began to crack. He relied on his family members, his nephew Vicente Carrillo Leyva, and the infamous paramilitary wing, La Línea, to defend his territory. Yet through all the chaos, El Viceroy remained unseen. His commands were whispered, his presence only rumored. He moved through a network of safe houses and ranches, guarded by men who would die before speaking his name. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes became a ghost in his own kingdom, a man whose silence ruled over a symphony of violence. In the next chapter, the empire fractures from within. Alliances crumble, the blood tide rises, and the man who once ruled from the shadows will face the light, hunted by his enemies and betrayed by his own. In the early 2000s, Ciudad Juárez was more than just a border town. It had become a global crossroads of trade, culture, and ambition. But this bustling stage was also an arena where powerful networks vied for control. At the center of it all stood one man, known for his precision and restraint, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, also known as El Viceroy. Under his leadership, the Juárez organization evolved into a massive logistical empire, a complex web moving products, money, and resources across continents. He built a system that stretched from the jungles of South America across the Gulf of Mexico and deep into the heart of North America. But with great success came intense competition, and new challenges began to surface from every direction. For decades, the lifeblood of Juárez was its factories and the steady flow of trade across the border. But as international attention shifted towards the movement of goods, scrutiny tightened. Suddenly, every shipment, every warehouse, and every transaction was under a microscope. The delicate balance that had allowed different groups to operate side by side started to crumble. Inside the Juárez network, trust became a fragile commodity. Outside, rivals saw a golden opportunity. What had once been a system of mutual understanding between old partners transformed into a high-stakes game of strategy and control. The focus was no longer just on transportation. It was about dominating the routes, the markets, and the influence that came with them. Tensions that had been simmering for years began to boil over, not with loud confrontations, but with quiet, strategic maneuvers, supply disruptions, and shifting alliances. Throughout this period, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes remained a man in the shadows, deliberately avoiding the public eye. He was a master of coordination, preferring careful planning and negotiation over open conflict. Those who worked with him described a meticulous leader, more like a corporate CEO than a street boss. He valued structure, precise accounting, and above all, loyalty. He built his empire on order. But in a world built on shifting loyalties and hidden agendas, even the most careful planner can't predict every outcome. The game was changing, and the pressure was building. The strategic location of Juárez was a prize coveted by many. Rival groups from other regions saw their chance to claim a piece of the city's economic power. Global demand, new technologies, and international partnerships were reshaping the entire landscape. To defend its position, the Juárez structure fortified its systems, operating with near-military precision. Specialized teams were created to manage security, finance, and transportation, all coordinated to maintain their hold on the vital trade corridors. But even the most efficient machine can break down under constant pressure, especially when it comes from both competitors and law enforcement. As the rivalries intensified, the people of Juárez felt the tensions seep into their daily lives. The city's rhythm changed, factories cut back on shifts, local businesses started closing their doors early, and a palpable sense of unease settled over the streets. Residents learned to navigate their own city with a new kind of caution. Economists called it a time of deep uncertainty, as a fragile economy was overshadowed by fear and speculation. For most families, the goal was simple but difficult: to maintain a sense of normalcy for their children, to keep life moving forward, despite the invisible conflict raging around them. By 2009, the dominoes began to fall. The once unbreakable structure of the Juárez organization started showing cracks. A series of high-profile arrests targeted key administrators and financial operators. Each detention was a strategic blow, severing another vital link in the chain. Governments on both sides of the border ramped up their cooperation, shifting their focus from open confrontation to a quieter, more effective strategy. Attacking the finances and logistics, bank accounts were frozen, properties were seized, and slowly, the organization's ability to move, communicate, and operate began to wither away. For Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, this meant a constant, draining battle to relocate, rebuild, and reorganize, trying to stay one step ahead of the closing net. Starting in 2006, the Mexican government launched an expanded campaign against organized crime. Troops began patrolling border regions, new checkpoints were established, and coordination with U.S. agencies reached unprecedented levels. In Juárez, this translated to constant surveillance. Aerial monitoring, financial tracking, and sophisticated data analysis became the new weapons in this war. The era of operating in secrecy was over. Information had become the most valuable asset. In response, Vicente adapted. He shrank his inner circle, relied on heavily coded communications, and drastically reduced his travel. Every move was calculated, every step taken with extreme caution, but the walls were closing in. Few photographs of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes even exist. He cultivated an image of a man who was everywhere and nowhere at once. Those who knew him described a calm and deliberate leader who rarely raised his voice, preferring quiet negotiation to loud threats. Over time, this quietness became part of his mythos, the invisible hand that could influence major events without ever being seen. He was a ghost in his own empire, a strategist who ruled from the shadows. By 2011, the landscape of power in northern Mexico had been completely redrawn. New organizations had risen, and the Juárez network's once unquestioned dominance had faded. For Vicente, survival meant scaling down operations, moving assets, and relying on old trusted alliances for protection. But in the digital age, even invisibility is temporary. Advanced monitoring and global intelligence sharing erased the very shadows that had protected him for so long. There was nowhere left to hide. After 2012, El Viceroy vanished. Rumors placed him in different regions across the country, but nothing was ever confirmed. For a time, it seemed his disappearance was absolute. The city of Juárez, exhausted by years of turmoil, slowly began the process of healing. Factories cautiously reopened, businesses returned, and the community focused on rebuilding. The story of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes started to fade into legend, a name whispered more as history than as a present-day threat. Then, in the quiet early morning hours of October 2014, the story reached its final chapter. After a multi-year investigation, federal agents located Vicente Carrillo Fuentes in the city of Torreón. The operation was swift, silent, and without a single shot fired. He was taken into custody peacefully. For law enforcement, it was a landmark victory. For Mexico, it marked the end of a long and turbulent era. In the years following the arrest, Juárez began to turn a corner. Community programs, civic organizations, and local businesses worked tirelessly to restore the city's spirit. International investors returned, and Juárez slowly reclaimed its reputation as a vital hub of manufacturing and trade. While challenges certainly remained, a new sense of hope took root. A collective belief that the city could be defined by its incredible resilience, not by its past struggles. History will remember Vicente Carrillo Fuentes not just as a powerful figure, but as a reflection of an era when global demand and hidden economies could shape entire regions. His story is less about the actions of one man and more about a complex system, how opportunity, ambition, and immense pressure can create empires that are ultimately destined to unravel. Today, the city of Juárez continues to build, to grow, and to look forward, proving that no matter how deep the shadows may fall, there is always a way back to the light. By 2014, the desert had fallen silent. The world that once whispered the name El Viceroy now spoke it only as a rumor. For nearly 2 decades, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes had moved unseen, a master of navigating a maze of alliances and disappearances. But every labyrinth has an exit, and every empire, a final chapter. When news of his detention broke that October morning, it seemed less like an explosion and more like a collective exhale. It was the end of an era that had reshaped the border itself. Authorities confirmed it quickly. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, once among the most elusive figures in the hemisphere, was in custody. There was no grand confrontation, no Hollywood spectacle, just quiet, methodical efficiency. Within hours, international media was calling it a symbolic capture. In television studios, analysts marked up maps and debated what this meant for Mexico's broader security campaign. But behind every headline lay the same fundamental question. What happens when the architect of a system disappears? In Juárez, the organization he had meticulously directed did not simply vanish overnight. Instead, the networks that had taken decades to build slowly dissolved or reinvented themselves. The pyramid flattened as the old command lines blurred, fracturing into smaller regional operations. Economists compared it to the breakup of a major corporation. When the leadership goes, the branches scatter. Some pursued new ventures, while others quietly faded into legitimate business. For Juárez itself, the change was palpable. Freight yards and industrial parks, once shrouded in secrecy, slowly came back to life. Commerce, not conflict, began to define the border once more. Following his arrest, Vicente faced a complex series of legal proceedings in both Mexico and the United States. The charges were extensive, focusing on organized crime involvement and sophisticated financial misconduct. The process was slow and deliberate, built on years of documentation and testimony. Observers noted his composure in public appearances, calm, contained, answering procedural questions in measured tones. It seemed to be the same discipline that had once defined his leadership, now redirected toward legal endurance. His defense team emphasized due process, while prosecutors spoke of accountability. The trials became less about spectacle and more about closure, a legal mirror reflecting decades of quiet, unparalleled power. While the courts deliberated, the city he once ruled was turning a new page. Civic groups, educators, and local entrepreneurs worked tirelessly to redefine Juárez's story. Universities launched new programs in technology and design. Art festivals returned to the public plazas. The border crossings, once marked by fear, began to buzz with the energy of commerce and collaboration. For the first time in years, the global conversation about Juárez started to focus on innovation, not instability. The desert landscape remained the same, harsh, beautiful, and unyielding, but the people walking it now carried a different purpose, a shared vision for the future. The world had changed dramatically since the 1990s. Technology now traced what once moved unseen. Satellite networks, sophisticated banking algorithms, and digital forensics had replaced the guesswork of the past. Vicente's story became a fascinating case study in evolution, a lesson in how secrecy fades in the bright light of global connectivity. Students in criminology and international business began to examine the Juárez era not for its notoriety, but for its insights into economics, governance, and globalization. It revealed the great paradox of the modern age. The more invisible a figure tries to become, the more visible the systems beneath them appear. After 2014, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes largely disappeared from the public conversation. Legal updates surfaced occasionally, but there were no interviews, no memoirs, no final statements. For journalists, it was as though the story had folded inward, a once dominant name reduced to a few lines in official records. Some interpreted this silence as acceptance. Others saw it as a final, calculated strategy. Either way, it marked the end of the performance. The man who had lived his life in the shadows had finally chosen stillness, fading from the world's stage. In the wake of this era, Mexico entered a new period of reform. Authorities restructured federal policing, strengthened transparency laws, and increased cooperation with neighboring countries. The hard-won lessons from decades of organized trade and corruption shaped policies for generations to come. Vicente's downfall was cited not just as a cautionary tale, but as powerful evidence that even the most entrenched systems could be forced to change. Reform is never immediate, but every case, every figure, adds another piece to the blueprint of how nations evolve and grow stronger. Artists, writers, and filmmakers began exploring the Carrillo Fuentes era. Not by mythologizing it, but by examining it through metaphor. Films depicted the border not as a battlefield, but as a crossroads, a complex space where ambition, poverty, and globalization collided. For many, Vicente became a symbol of duality. the coexistence of progress and corruption, loyalty and fear, silence and control. And in that duality lay the broader story of Mexico's late 20th century, its brilliance, its contradictions, and its incredible resilience. Economists later analyzed the financial impact of dismantling such a large, informal network. They found that as these structures receded, legitimate business initiatives rushed in to fill the void. The Mexican government invested heavily in border infrastructure, logistics, and manufacturing. As a result, Juárez's export economy grew again, attracting global partners in the automotive, electronics, and agricultural sectors. Where secrecy once ruled, transparency began to pay dividends. It was a quiet revolution, measured not in explosive headlines, but in jobs created and lives stabilized. The Carrillo Fuentes family name, which once commanded fear, now provokes quiet reflection. Several relatives sought ordinary lives, consciously distancing themselves from the legacy that had defined their youth. Time, it seems, does what courts cannot. It softens the sharp edges of history. The dynasty that built an empire across the desert slowly gave way to new generations, more interested in education and renewal than in reputation and power. Every story of dominance ends with the same universal lesson. Power is only as lasting as the structures that support it. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes understood this principle better than most. He organized his world like a chessboard, where every move was carefully measured. But in the end, time, technology, and a global demand for accountability changed the rules of the game itself. His empire did not fall through a dramatic confrontation, but through a quiet evolution. The world simply moved on. Today, Juárez stands as a powerful symbol of endurance. It has learned that a city's identity is not defined by its darkest years, but by how it recovers from them. The city that once lived under a cloud of suspicion now builds, trades, and innovates with the same fierce energy that once fueled its secrecy. And somewhere, in the footnotes of that remarkable transformation, lies the story of El Viceroy. A quiet reminder that control, no matter how absolute it seems, is always temporary. Every empire leaves behind two stories, the one history records and the one people remember. The story of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, known as El Viceroy, is both. It's a story of calculated ambition, of silence and structure. But more than that, it's the story of how a city and a country found its way back from the shadows. There was a time when Ciudad Juárez was defined only by what it had lost: its safety, its stability, its certainty. But as the years went by, a new story began to unfold. Factories hummed back to life, families started to return, and artists took to the streets, painting over walls that once marked fear with vibrant colors of hope. Community leaders, teachers, and young entrepreneurs reclaimed the very streets once avoided, filling them with movement and life once again. They built cooperatives, schools, and cultural centers, powerful symbols of normalcy and a resurgent pride. To walk through Juárez today is to witness resilience in motion. It's a city that learned a vital lesson: survival is not enough. What truly matters is transformation. By the late 2010s, Juárez was on its way to becoming one of Mexico's leading manufacturing hubs again. Its factories, the famous maquiladoras, employed thousands, producing goods for global markets. International trade brought a new kind of power, one that was legitimate, visible, and accountable. Investors returned not because of secrecy and shadows, but because of trust. Economists now refer to it as the Juárez model, a powerful case study in economic recovery driven by transparency and reinvestment. The same geography that once fed conflict now fuels commerce. It is a powerful reminder that a city's greatest resource isn't its location or its wealth, but its people. In Mexico City, the government was forced to rethink its entire approach to national security. Reaction was replaced with reform. Speculation gave way to data. A new generation of leaders began to emphasize education, prevention, and institutional integrity. The era of unchecked, shadowy power began to yield to one of oversight. It's an imperfect, evolving system, but a real one. For Mexico, the fall of the Juárez network wasn't just a legal victory. It was a profound psychological one. It proved that the delicate balance between fear and law could shift, and that no name, no matter how powerful, could remain untouchable forever. The story of the Carrillo Fuentes organization became a global lesson in the double-edged nature of globalization. It showed that when markets expand faster than regulations, dark shadows grow in the spaces between. International organizations began to study the Juárez case to understand how trade routes, finance, and technology can intersect in both productive and destructive ways. From corporate boardrooms to policy schools, academics and leaders discussed El Viceroy not as folklore, but as a framework. By understanding his rise, they found a blueprint for reform. And by understanding his fall, they learned the staggering cost of neglect. For those who study the man himself, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes remains an enigma. He was reserved, methodical, rarely seen, never theatrical. Even at the height of his power, he actively avoided the spotlight, preferring structure over spectacle. His quietness became part of his legend. His discipline was both his greatest strength and his ultimate downfall. To some, he symbolizes the last of an old era, when control was built on secrecy and silence. To others, he is a stark warning of what happens when ambition escapes accountability. A decade after his arrest, the streets of Juárez tell a completely different story. Where tension once thrived, creativity now flourishes. Young people are building startups, opening cafes, and turning the border into a cultural bridge rather than a dividing line. In their art, their music, and their films, you can feel a quiet defiance, the spirit of a generation determined to define their city not by what it endured, but by what it has become. Time has a way of softening even the hardest of stories. The whispers that once carried El Viceroy's name are now fading into history. What remains is not his shadow, but the light that followed it. Every empire that falls leaves behind an echo. In Juárez, that echo became a vow, a promise to rebuild, to remember, and to always move forward. When historians write about Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, they will speak of control, of power, of structure. But perhaps the real story isn't about the man at all. Perhaps it's about what came after. The incredible resilience of a city, the awakening of a nation, and the return of faith in progress. In the grand scope of Mexico's history, his chapter is one of transition. A painful but necessary shift from secrecy to transparency, from fear to reform. It was the end of an era, and the beginning of accountability. The desert remembers everything. It remembers the silence, the ambition, and the lessons carved in its sand. But as the wind blows across Juárez tonight, it carries something new. The sound of renewal, of laughter, of life continuing. The empire is gone. The city remains. And its people. They are the true story.
The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe at Join Criminology and step deeper into the dark with us.